операций. К примеру, в августе, по данным ООН, число отказов удвоилось в 2 раза по сравнению с июлем. Очевидно, что открытые на сегодняшний день маршруты со стороны Иордании, Египта и Израиля не позволяют доставлять необходимые объемы гуманитарной помощи. По факту, сейчас их среднесуточная пропускная способность всего 70 грузовиков, когда еще до кризиса в Газу заезжало по 500 грузовиков в день. Цифры говорят сами за себя. Если дело так пойдет дальше, то все происходящее может привести к прекращению деятельности ООН в секторе Газа. В таком случае более 2 миллионов палестинцев окажутся один на один со смертью. Это не фигура речи, а реальная перспектива. Этого допустить нельзя. Совету необходимо сделать все, чтобы исключить данный сценарий, заинтересованность в котором не скрывает часть израильского истеблишмента. Инструментарий для этого у Совета Безопасности есть. Нет лишь политической воли у США и их сателлитов. По сути, все, что ООН может записать себе в актив сегодня, это продолжающаяся кампания по вакцинации детей от полиомиелита. Надеемся, что гуманитарные паузы для вакцинации сработают. Вместе с тем нет смысла сегодня делать акцент на этих усилиях, поскольку ситуация с полиомиелитом – это лишь одна из многочисленных проблем, с которыми сталкивается население анклава. Ведь в условиях полного разрушения системы санитарии и здравоохранения в анклаве в любой момент может произойти вспышка и других инфекционных заболеваний. В Газе почти исчерпаны запасы обычных вакцин от туберкулеза или для иммунизации против дифтерии, столбняка и коклюша. Пациенты же с тяжелыми хроническими заболеваниями при критически низких запасах лекарств, вроде инсулина, просто обречены. Задача поставки базовых лекарственных препаратов Газу требует немедленного решения. А Израиль к подобным запросам, насколько мы можем судить, не восприимчив. Господин председатель, давайте не будем никого вводить в заблуждение. В условиях продолжающейся уже более 11 месяцев военной операции Израиля, спонсором и куратором которой являются власти США, адекватное оказание помощи населению сектора попросту невозможно. Гуманитарщики беззащитны перед израильскими обстрелами и просто бесчеловечно требовать от них погибать под ударами в условиях, когда члены Совета уже почти год ходят по кругу и никак не могут заставить власти Израиля остановить свою карательную военную машину. Напомним, что если решение Совета Безопасности о прекращении огня, которое у нас формально уже есть, не соблюдается, то члены Совета могут рассмотреть меры, как обеспечить его выполнение. У СБ есть соответствующий опыт и все необходимые рычаги и средства, в том числе в контексте миротворческого присутствия на Ближнем Востоке. Коллеги, мы все с вами прекрасно понимаем, что пока идут интенсивные боевые действия, нереалистично рассчитывать на какой-либо значимый прогресс в стабилизации гуманитарной обстановки на земле и наращивание гуманитарного содействия населению Газа. Всем нам важно признать один простой факт. Проблема не в наличии или отсутствии какого-либо механизма доставки гуманитарной помощи, а в отсутствии для этого условий из-за военных действий, исключения из которых израильтяне не делают ни для школ и больниц, ни для гуманитарных конвоев ООН. Поэтому, что бы сегодня ни говорилось в этом зале по гуманитарным вопросам, первостепенная задача заключается в обеспечении немедленного и повсеместного прекращения огня в Газе. Только речь должна на этот раз идти не о пустышке вроде резолюции 2735, которая была не жизнеспособна еще в момент своего принятия, и мы об этом много раз говорили, а о реальном четком требовании со стороны Совета. Только после этого можно всерьез говорить о решении проблем в области гуманитарного содействия мирным газовитянам. Что касается призывов, которые мы слышим, сосредоточиться на вопросе восстановления сектора, то он, безусловно, крайне важен. Однако он относится к далекой перспективе, а прежде чем говорить о послезавтрашнем дне, нужно хотя бы понимать, как будет выглядеть день завтрашний. И дать оценку дню сегодняшнему, а не стыдливо замалчивать имеющиеся в нашем распоряжении факты. Что вообще останется от Газа, если военная операция Израиля будет продолжаться нынешними темпами? А что станет с остающимися в живых израильскими заложниками? Их судьба вообще не интересует израильские власти, и они уже приняли решение пожертвовать большинством из них? А именно к этому, к сожалению, все и идет. Надеемся, что у всех членов Совета Безопасности все же проявится чувство коллективной ответственности за происходящее в анклаве, и мы совместно сможем безотлагательно выработать необходимые меры по деэскалации, а также добиться их реализации. Пока, к сожалению, признаков этого мы не видим. И продолжаем слушать пустые и лицемерные призывы в этом зале. Благодарю вас.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie Madame Kaag pour sa présentation et surtout pour son engagement inlassable sur le terrain. La France soutient son mandat. Elle exige aussi la mise en œuvre complète et sans délai des résolutions 2712, 2720, 2728 et 2735. J'insisterai sur 2 points. Premièrement, le droit international humanitaire doit être respecté par tous. La protection des travailleurs humanitaires doit être garantie en toutes circonstances. La multiplication des incidents à leur encontre est intolérable. Des mécanismes de déconfliction doivent être mis en place. Le bon déroulement de la campagne de vaccination contre la polio montre que c'est possible. Il est essentiel de lever les obstacles à l'aide. Tous les points d'accès doivent pouvoir être utilisés alors que les populations civiles de Gaza sont en situation d'urgence absolue. La Cour internationale de justice l'a exigé. Les marchandises qui entrent dans Gaza doivent correspondre à la réalité des besoins et parvenir à leurs bénéficiaires. Il existe encore de trop nombreuses restrictions quant aux objets et denrées qui peuvent entrer dans Gaza, en particulier pour les infrastructures de santé, mais aussi pour l'eau et l'assainissement et le traitement des déchets. Les Nations unies et les acteurs humanitaires doivent pouvoir recevoir les équipements leur permettant d'agir sur le terrain. La France appelle enfin à la libération de tous les otages. Deuxièmement, nous devons redonner un horizon aux populations de Gaza. Un cessez-le-feu immédiat et permanent est indispensable. Mais nous devons également, dès à présent, en lien avec les pays de la région, créer les conditions de la reconstruction avec des projets de relèvement précoce pour établir les services de base. La France soutient le travail de la coordinatrice spéciale à cet égard. Il faudra sans doute revoir son mandat. La vie de 2 millions de personnes est en jeu. Monsieur le Président, il est urgent de parvenir à un règlement politique du conflit israélo-palestinien. Seul l'établissement d'un État palestinien unifié, indépendant, viable et contigu, vivant en paix et en sécurité aux côtés d'Israël, garantira la sécurité au Proche-Orient. Une réponse strictement humanitaire ne suffira pas, tout comme une réponse exclusivement sécuritaire. Sinon, la crise actuelle recommencera encore et encore. La France continuera de s'engager dans la voie d'une sortie de crise fondée sur la solution à 2 États. Il faut en parallèle des garanties de sécurité pour les Israéliens, auxquels la France rappelle sa solidarité à la suite des attaques terroristes du 7 octobre. L'autorité palestinienne a un rôle central à jouer dans ce processus, en Cisjordanie comme à Gaza, qui a vocation à faire partie de cet État palestinien. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, Ms. Sigrid Kaag, and Executive Director, Mr. Jose Moreira de Silva of UNOPS, for their important briefing. As we have listened in this chamber almost every week to report about the humanitarian and security situation in the Gaza Strip, one can hardly imagine what it is like for the men, women, and children who live the harrowing, nightmarish reality of death, torture, displacement, hunger, and diseases every day. The adoption of Resolution 2720 and all other resolutions of the Council regarding the conflict in the Gaza Strip were seen as beacons of hope, particularly in underscoring, and I quote, the importance of coordination, humanitarian notification, and deconfliction mechanisms in 2712, and the need to facilitate, coordinate, monitor, and verify the expedited delivery of humanitarian assistance to the civilian population in the Gaza Strip, with the appointment of a senior humanitarian and reconstruction coordinator. Regrettably, almost a year to the current phase of the escalation of the conflict, and months after the adoption of resolutions 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735, their full implementation is disturbingly lacking. Violence and deliberate obstruction continue to undermine humanitarian effort. Aid workers must deal with many bureaucratic measures aimed at preventing them from accessing the devastated population in the Gaza Strip, or are outrightly denied access at checkpoints during major humanitarian deliveries. According to OCHA, the frequency of denial of access by Israeli authorities nearly doubled in August as compared to July 2024. It is also reported that persistent obstacles hampering entrance of aid vehicles through the Karim Shalom crossing are causing shortages of medical supplies throughout the Gaza Strip. It is even more alarming when humanitarian personnel themselves are subject to violent attacks contrary to international humanitarian law. In this regard, we reiterate a strong condemnation by the Secretary General of an attack on the UNRWA school serving as a shelter in Nusrat, central Gaza, that killed 6 UNRWA personnel, as well as women and children. These actions, which violate international law, including international humanitarian law, cannot be justified under any circumstances. Repeated evacuation orders are shrinking the so-called safe zones in the Gaza Strip and increasing danger for many displaced Palestinians sheltering in makeshift sites. The report of an Israeli airstrike on 10 September in Al-Mawasi, part of Khan Yunis, confirmed this unacceptable narrative. The constant bombardment and exchange of rockets between the Israeli Defense Forces and Hamas and the other militant groups in the Gaza Strip for the past 11 months has severely affected critical infrastructure and cropland areas. A satellite assessment conducted by the United Nations Satellite Center revealed that 68% of the roads and cropland areas across the Gaza Strip have been destroyed. It is estimated that there has been over $18.5 billion United States dollars of infrastructural damage to the area. Mr. President, full operationalization of SCR 2720 will require achieving an immediate and permanent ceasefire and restoration of law and order in a society now characterized at the barest minimum as a war crime scene, lawlessness, looting, and social disorder. The absence of internal security structures has increased risk of attacks on aid convoys and humanitarian personnel. As we collectively pursue the objective of making humanitarian aid delivery process faster, efficient, and directly beneficial to civilians in the occupied Palestinian territory, and as we assess the reconstruction outlook, Sierra Leone would like to state the following. Firstly, we acknowledge the significance to facilitate, coordinate, monitor, and verify unhindered humanitarian aid delivery into Gaza, and the relevance for reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, and the work of the Office of the Senior Humanitarian Reconstruction Coordinator, including through meaningful engagement at all levels with relevant stakeholders. Sierra Leone remains supportive of this work and its continuation, and we emphasize that the provision of and access to humanitarian aid and essential services, which are scarce in supply in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, should remain a priority during the allocation of relief consignment. Secondly, we reiterate our call for all conflicting parties to strictly adhere to the obligations under international law, in particular international humanitarian law, and all relevant resolutions of this Council aim at protecting civilians, including humanitarian workers and civilian infrastructure. An effective deconfliction mechanism is also necessary to guarantee the safety and security of all humanitarian personnel and allow for rapid facilitation of humanitarian relief. We welcome the operationalization of the UN mechanism that supported the timely delivery of 1.6 million doses of polio vaccine type 2 to the Gaza Strip, currently being administered to the at-risk children. As the first round of the polio vaccination campaign has ended, it is absolutely critical that medical and aid personnel are able to continue with the next round throughout Gaza. We maintain our view that an immediate and permanent ceasefire will significantly improve the humanitarian situation on the ground. Therefore, we call on the parties to the conflict to recommit to the ongoing diplomatic efforts and explore options to resolve outstanding issues and conclude the negotiations. An end to the current conflict will allow for the arduous but vital task of rebuilding Gaza to start, to make it habitable and a home to its people. The establishment of state functions for governance, security and law, and public administration, reconstruction of essential services for water, sanitation, transportation, housing, and establishment of structural systems and processes for private sector revitalization can only be achieved with the cessation of hostilities. Mr. President, in our maiden statement on the Middle East Palestine question this year, we noted the significance of the prevailing context, that is the continuing occupation by Israel of the Palestinian territories and the post-7 October 2023 escalation. Accordingly, the issue of humanitarian aid coordination and reconstruction must now be gleaned through the lens of the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. With regards to the germane issue of the right to self-determination, the Court considered that while it is for the General Assembly and the Security Council to pronounce on the modalities required to ensure an end to Israel's illegal presence in the occupied Palestinian territory and the full realization of the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, all states must cooperate with the United Nations to put those modalities into effect. Additionally, all the state parties to the Fourth Geneva Conventions have the obligation, while respecting the Charter of the United Nations and international law, to ensure compliance by Israel with international humanitarian law as embodied in that convention. In effect, the true response to a lasting, sustainable reconstruction of Gaza and other parts of the occupied Palestinian territory is for the unlawful occupation to be put to an end and for the necessary modalities to be put in place by the General Assembly and the Security Council, including the declaration of a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip in line with the UN Charter. It has been made clear that this is a legal obligation for which all member states must cooperate. Let me close, Mr. President, by continuing the look at the future from the SDG 4 perspective and leaving no one behind. Sierra Leone, a strong advocate for education, remembers the children in the Gaza Strip and other parts of the occupied Palestinian territory who have been denied access to learning due to ongoing hostilities and displacement. We stand in solidarity with these young minds, acknowledging the devastating impact of this prolonged conflict on their education. With this future generation in mind, we will continue to work towards a peaceful and lasting solution to the conflict. Without doubt, to even reconstruct or re-engage the mine, let alone the land, there must be a ceasefire. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Senior Coordinator Kaag and UNOPS Executive Director Moreira da Silva for their informative and sobering briefings. Gaza's agony continues. Japan is appalled at the ever-increasing death toll, which has now exceeded 41,000, including many children, mostly women, and including many civilians, mostly women and children. We remain concerned. Israel's repeated evacuation orders have left nearly the entire population of the Gaza Strip squeezed into only 10% of the land. Much of it is not fit for human habitation, and basic essentials such as food, clean water, and sanitation are difficult to come by. Swift, effective, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid is crucial to alleviate the suffering of Palestinians. But this requires a safe operating environment, which Gaza unfortunately does not have. While Japan welcomes the humanitarian pauses have led to successful rounds of emergency polio vaccination campaign, it is gravely concerning the humanitarian access remains severely constrained due to insecurity and long delays. Israel's attacks in densely populated areas continue unabated. The recent airstrike on a school in Nuseirat killed 6 UNRWA staff members. Japan deplores the casualties of aid workers who are tirelessly working to deliver the necessary relief supplies to the people of Gaza. We are frustrated and deeply disappointed. Our appeal for protecting humanitarian personnel and UN staff has not been heard, and that the loss of their lives continues. This is totally unacceptable, and actions need to be taken to make real changes on the ground. UN staff and partners must be able to safely carry out their duties. Let us be clear. Compliance with international humanitarian law is not a matter of discretion, but an obligation for all member states, including Israel. Mr. President, Japan praises the efforts led by Ms. Kaag and her team to increase the flow of aid through multiple corridors and improve coordination and access. We also note that the 2720 mechanism is consulting with key parties and within the UN to ensure preparedness for a ceasefire by pre-positioning supplies and utilizing all aid routes into Gaza. These facts shows Ms. Kaag's mandate and her reporting to the Council under Resolution 2720 remains critical. Japan expresses strong support for the renewal of her reporting mandate and will actively participate in the Council discussions to that end. Mr. President, as stated by many of our colleagues around this table and echoed by voices around the world, ceasefire in Gaza is the only path toward peace, security, and stability in the region. Japan continues to extend our strong support to the diplomatic efforts by the US, Qatar, and Egypt that would lead to an immediate ceasefire, the release of the remaining hostages, and delivery of humanitarian aid at scale in Gaza. At the same time, the ceasefire will be only the first step toward a sustainable peace in Israel and Palestine. Ultimately, only a two-state solution can finally resolve this tragic conflict. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank Ms. Kaag and Mr. De Silva for their briefings. The adoption of Resolution 2720 represented a glimmer of hope for the people of Gaza last December, and we are truly appreciative of Ms. Kaag's tireless efforts over the past 8 months. Unfortunately, the situation on the ground remains beyond desperate. Despite endless appeals by the international community, military tactics are still being used to deny essential services to the Gazan population. It is heart-wrenching to see the people of Gaza suffer acute hunger, with famine conditions affecting over 1 million people. 80% of the population has faced repeated evacuation orders, complicating the vanishingly insufficient aid delivery taking place. Entire communities have been crammed into so-called humanitarian zones, which are regularly targeted by the Israeli military. Markets, schools, mosques, churches, hospitals, health clinics, roads, water mains, and electricity lines have been destroyed. Over 70,000 tons of explosives have been dropped onto the strip in the past 11 months. The official death toll stands at 41,000 killed and 95,000 wounded. President, it is deeply troubling that those who are dedicated to assisting the most vulnerable are at risk of becoming targets themselves in Gaza and the West Bank. Less than 2 weeks ago, a clearly marked WPF convoy in Gaza came under fire from the Israeli forces. On 9 September, a fully notified and deconflicted UN convoy carrying 12 staff members for a polio vaccination campaign was rammed with tanks and bulldozers, and shots were fired. On 11 September, an UNRWA school in Nuseirat that was sheltering 12,000 people was struck by missiles. 34 people lost their lives, including 6 UNRWA workers. This incident is the latest in a long line of attacks that have, this year alone, resulted in the deaths of around 200 UN and humanitarian staff in Gaza. The repeated targeting and intimidation of the United Nations in Gaza is deeply concerning. President, if there is to be any cessation of this destruction and unabated violence in Gaza, we, the members of this Council, must demand and ensure the full implementation of all Security Council resolutions, adherence to international law, and accountability. Countries with influence over the parties must also continue to strive to bring this bloodshed to an end. The full and immediate implementation of the ICJ Provisional Measures Orders is an essential first step, particularly as they relate to the unhindered facilitation of humanitarian assistance and the cessation of attacks against the civilian population. We stress that humanitarian assistance must never be up for negotiation. It is a legal obligation enshrined in the Geneva Conventions and its additional protocols. States providing military support must also ensure that their armaments are used in a manner that is consistent with IHL. President, as we approach the one-year mark of this dreadful conflict, this Council must not reduce itself to simply commenting helplessly on this catastrophe. I repeat, a permanent ceasefire is needed without further delay. Nevertheless, this would just be the first step out of this nightmare. The road after that will be an even more arduous one. Yet, although we still cannot see the light at the end of this very dark tunnel, peace must never be regarded as an unattainable goal. On the contrary, we must never give up. We must redouble our efforts to make sure that once this conflict is over, we lay the foundations to secure a just and lasting peace. A peace based on a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as a future capital of two states living side by side in peace and security, in line with all the relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I must begin by addressing a matter of grave concern. The recent loss of 6 UNRWA staff members in Israeli strikes is not merely condemnable. It is a stark reminder of the perilous erosion of international norms that we have long labored to establish. Such incident, along with attacks on other humanitarian personnel, including the WFP convoy strike, at the very heart of the principles enshrined in the international humanitarian law. We stand at a critical juncture. As Mr. Lazzarini, General Commissioner of UNRWA, wisely observed, the longer impunity prevails, the more international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions will become irrelevant. This is a path we cannot afford to tread. Mr. President, I thank Mrs. Sigrid Kaag and USG Moreira da Silva for their briefings. I commend Mrs. Sigrid Kaag for her effort in implementing Resolution 2720. This resolution, born of noble intent, sought to ensure an impeding flow of humanitarian aid to Gaza. Gaza, starving population. Yet, 9 months on, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The mechanism we have established, while now operationally sound, has not yielded the intended impact. The figures are before us as a reminder. The stark reality is that daily aid deliveries have decreased significantly since the Resolution 2720 adoption last December. According to UN data, only 62 trucks entered Gaza daily during the first 10 days of this month, compared to 97 trucks in December 2023. Before the resolution was adopted, there were more than 500 trucks last year. This is not a logistical shortcoming. It is a manifestation of a deeper, more intractable political impasse deliberately caused by the Israeli authorities. And we must recognize that our well-intentioned effort to address a political crisis through purely logistical or humanitarian means have proven insufficient. In this context, I must emphasize again and again that a ceasefire in Gaza is not merely desirable, it is imperative, without condition. Mr. President, even in these dark times, there are glimmers of hope. The recent polio vaccination campaign, which by the 13th of September had reached over 560,000 of the total of 632 100,000 children in Gaza. It is a testament of what can be achieved if there is a political will. We commend the work of WHO, UNICEF, and especially UNRWA. For this achievement, we commend the work of Mrs. Kaag and her team. This achievement demonstrates what is possible when there is a political will, when there is effective coordination between the UN agencies and the international donors. It underscores several critical points. First, while law and order have deteriorated in Gaza, it cannot justify the low level of humanitarian aid access. I repeat, the current situation is the result of the occupying power policy. Its cooperation is pivotal in facilitating humanitarian effort, not opposing by administrative means. An example, why these 11 staff members of UNOPS were not able to reach Gaza for months now. Second, interagency coordination is essential for effective action in Gaza. Third, UNRWA role is indispensable, with its staff at the forefront of crucial initiative. It has been again highlighted during the polio vaccination campaign. Four, early recovery project must be prioritized to prevent further deterioration of living conditions of the Gazans. If polio is preventable through vaccination, other diseases may not be. We must act before it is too late. Mr. President, the path forward is clear through challenging. Fulfilling the mandate of Resolution 2720 requires not only a ceasefire, but also the restoration of stability in Gaza and the implementation of a comprehensive and well-coordinated reconstruction plan. Central to this effort must be the empowerment of the Palestinian Authority to govern Gaza effectively. The international community bears a weighty responsibility. It is incumbent upon us to work tirelessly toward achieving a ceasefire and laying the ground for a more stable and prosperous future for the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, Mozambique thanks Slovenia's presidency for convening this important briefing. We highly value the updated information offered by Ms. Sigrid Kaag, ESG and Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza. Our briefing today gives us a picture of the gloomy humanitarian situation in Gaza in light of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2720 of 22nd December 2023. We wish to reiterate our strong support to Ms. Kaag and our team. We praise their devoted work for the Palestinian people, which is to say, to our own common humanity. We thank Mr. Jorge Moreira da Silva, Executive Director of UNOPS, for the briefing and for the work in Gaza and Palestine, the work carried out by him and his team. Mr. President, the adoption of by the Security Council of the resolution above is a testament to our collective recognition of the severe suffering faced by the civilian population in Gaza and the urgent need for coordinated efforts to provide the relief and support. Regrettably, those Security Council efforts have not been matched by the action of the conflicting parties. 9 months after the adoption of Resolution 2720, the situation in Gaza has worsened. The humanitarian crisis has deepened, and the resolution we have adopted in December is far from achieving its intended results. In this connection, the prevailing situation continues to be a matter of great concern. It continues to demand our profound reflection and action, as this is one of the biggest humanitarian crises. And our incapacity to address this crisis adequately constitutes a blight in our conscience. From escalation to escalation, the conflict has been claiming more lives. It has been causing more displacement, and it has been inflicting widespread and indiscriminate destruction of civilian infrastructure. In short, an immense and horrendous tragedy has befallen the people of Gaza with no end in sight. We note in that regard that the degree of insecurity also impacts directly and negatively on the humanitarian assistance to those in need, as it hinders safe mobility of humanitarian workers on the ground. The reconstruction of Gaza is a critical and urgent task, especially after 11 months of intensive conflict and destruction. But we are also conscious of the fact that the current state of conflict, reconstruction of Gaza, is a challenging undertaking, to say the least. The conflict poses a permanent risk to any reconstruction effort. Residences, schools, hospitals, health wards, places of refuge are a target of war and destruction. We can hardly speak of reconstruction under these circumstances. As Council members, we shoulder the obligation and the responsibility to change the course of events. We must continue to work for the cessation of hostilities and a ceasefire. They are an urgent imperative for peace in Gaza and in the region. Only this option can pave the way for a sustainable plan of reconstruction, as it is clear that a reconstruction without peace cannot be viable. Mr. President, the recent humanitarian pause that has allowed for polio vaccination on children constitutes a clear indication that ceasefire and peace are possible if the warring parties have the political will to follow the path of mutual accommodation and peace. This is the reason why we place our hopes in and encouragement for the diplomatic efforts by the United States of America, Egypt, Qatar, and other countries in the region, aimed at finding a negotiated solution leading to a permanent ceasefire. Mozambique wishes once again to underscore that the vision of a two-state solution, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security, as full members of the United Nations, must continue to guide our collective efforts. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Senior Coordinator Kaag and Director Maria de Silva, for your sobering briefings. And I also thank you for all of your efforts to get assistance to the Palestinian people in Gaza. At the outset, let me reiterate my outrage and President Biden's outrage at the death of Asenir Agi, an American citizen shot and killed in the West Bank last week. No one should have to put their life at risk simply for attending a protest, for freely expressing their views. This horrific tragedy should never have happened. We will continue to demand details and continue to demand access into Israel's investigation and press for accountability regarding the circumstances that led to Asenir's death. I also offer my sincere and heartfelt condolences to Asenir's family and friends. Her death, like that of so many others over the past year, was tragic and unnecessary. We must not grow numb to human suffering, no matter who and where it occurs. Colleagues, notwithstanding the efforts of Senior Coordinator Kaag, her UN colleagues, and humanitarians on the ground, the situation in Gaza remains catastrophic. Children are dying, suffering from preventable illnesses, missing schools. Thousands have lost parents, relatives, teachers, and friends, and have the physical and psychological scars to show for it. In recent weeks, there have also been numerous attacks in which UN personnel and humanitarian workers have been injured or killed. We offer our deepest condolences to the families of UN personnel killed and recognize the tragic and unprecedented toll this conflict has taken on the UN family. Colleagues, many of these incidents were preventable. We will continue to raise the need for Israel to facilitate humanitarian operations and protect humanitarian workers and facilities, such as the UNRWA school targeted by the IDF last week in Nasrat. We have also been unequivocal in communicating to Israel that there is no basis, absolutely none, for its forces to be opening fire on clearly marked UN vehicles, as recently occurred on numerous occasions. The IDF is a professional military and knows well how to ensure that incidents such as these do not happen. And so the United States expects the IDF's leadership will implement fundamental changes in the way the IDF operate, including changes to their rules of engagement and steps to fix the obvious shortcomings in how the deconfliction procedures are implemented. At the same time, we continue to see Hamas hiding in and taking over and otherwise using civilian sites to conduct operations and pose an ongoing threat. There's no clear evidence of Hamas's total indifference to Palestinian civilians in Gaza. For their sake and the sake of innocent people on all sides of this conflict, this must stop. All sides to the conflict must adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians. Colleagues, these recent incidents underscore once again the urgency of reaching a ceasefire with a release of hostages, as this Council called for in Resolution 2735. That is the best way to ensure humanitarians can safely and effectively carry out their life-saving work and massively increase the flow of humanitarian assistance to those who desperately need it. Until such a ceasefire is reached, we continue to work hard toward that end. It is vital that Israel cooperate with the UN to improve humanitarian access and humanitarian conditions generally. Palestinian civilians in Gaza have endured far too much suffering. We're pleased that the first round of polio vaccinations in Gaza has been largely successful, reaching 90% of its target population. And we commend the humanitarian community and all participating UN agencies for their life-saving work. And we thank them for their commitment and their sacrifice. We also encourage the continued cooperation between Israel and the humanitarian community to make this campaign happen. This level of cooperation should be the norm, not the exception. Indeed, the polio campaign is evidence that this can be done, that life-saving assistance can get to those in need without undercutting Israel's security. And so we call on Israel to invest just as much energy into the broader humanitarian effort in Gaza as it did for this first round of this vaccination campaign. Colleagues, 3 weeks from today, we will make a grim milestone, 1 year since Hamas's barbaric October 7th attack. 1 year since 1,200 citizens from Israel and many other countries were massacred, and hundreds more taken into the tunnels beneath Gaza, where many still wait in captivity today. They must be released immediately to their families. And 1 year since the civilians of Gaza first began to bear the brunt of a terrible conflict set in motion by Hamas. It bears repeating that it is manifestly in the interest of Israelis, Palestinians, and civilians in every country in the region for this desperation and this devastation to end, for there to be a ceasefire. We continue to work with Egypt and Qatar to find a way forward in the negotiations that will be acceptable to both parties. But as hard as we're going to work on texts and creative formulas, this is ultimately a question of political will. Whether or not leaders on both sides are prepared to recognize that enough is enough, and that the time has come to make some hard choices and some difficult compromises to end this carnage. We urge all council members with influence over Hamas to join others in pressing its leaders to stop stalling, make these compromises, and accept the deal without delay. Lives depend on it. The future depends on it. Colleagues, we remain committed to a two-state solution that will allow Israelis and Palestinians to live side by side in peace and security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I wish to thank you for organizing today's briefing, and I express appreciation to Senior Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her update on the implementation of the mandate given her in Resolution 2720. I also thank Under Secretary General Jorge Moreira da Silva for his briefing. Mr. President, the operating environment in Gaza has become extremely challenging and dangerous, primarily owing to the grave security situation. Humanitarian actors and UN personnel who continue to operate in Gaza do so at serious personal risk, as we have seen time and time again, including with the recent attack on the Al-Nusrat refugee camp, where 6 UNRWA staff were killed. Indeed, this war is the deadliest for the United Nations, with 224 UN personnel senselessly killed. Guyana therefore applauds the unselfish and unflinching decision of those who press on in these unfathomable circumstances. It is unfortunate that the parties have to be continuously reminded of their obligations under international humanitarian law to ensure the protection of humanitarian actors. These appeals have been to no avail, as evidenced by the continuing non-functioning of deconfliction and coordination mechanisms and the direct attacks and intimidation that many of them face. This must stop now. Mr. President, having examined the Senior Coordinator's update on the implementation of Resolution 2720 as of 2nd September, one sees tiny threads of optimism interwoven throughout the report. We note, for example, that the Senior Coordinator has been able to engage the parties and other stakeholders at the highest political level, resulting in improved access, enhanced logistical capabilities, and the operationalization of the 2720 mechanism, inter alia. While we commend the incremental progress, Guyana remains deeply concerned by assessments which show that the humanitarian situation in Gaza remains extremely dire. We note, for example, that 96% of the population is facing acute food insecurity. Civilian infrastructure continues to be destroyed, with OCHA reporting significant damage increases since July, and that violence and obstruction continue to impede humanitarian aid workers' ability to support those in need. Most importantly, and foundational to all humanitarian efforts, a ceasefire appears to be elusive. Guyana believes that there will be a deal for a ceasefire only when there is sincere concern for the protection of civilians, including the persons taken hostage on 7th October. As of now, that concern is largely absent, despite narratives to the contrary. Mr. President, turning now to the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip. This will be a monumental task with heavy financial implications. But let us not forget that the destruction of Gaza is not because of a natural disaster. This is Israel's doing. We are all familiar with the consistent spate of military operations against the Gaza Strip by Israel prior to 7th of October and the resulting destruction of civilian infrastructure. The pattern of financing and refinancing reconstruction in Gaza is unsustainable, and the international community, including this Council, must contemplate measures to end this cycle so that Palestinians are not left behind in the global quest for sustainable development. Guyana believes that the only viable reconstruction plan is one that includes a roadmap to the two-state solution with the relevant security guarantees. Against the foregoing, Mr. President, Guyana reiterates the following appeals. First, we call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, for an end to all hostilities in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Guyana is prepared to work with fellow Council members both to mandate the permanent cessation of hostilities in the occupied Palestinian territories and to activate the relevant provisions of the Charter to ensure that this mandate is adhered to. Second, we call for the immediate and unconditional release of all persons taken hostage from Israel on 7th of October. We reiterate that the taking of hostages is a war crime. We also call for the release of Palestinians detained in Israeli prisons without charge. In both cases, persons have the right to be treated with dignity and respect, to be free from torture and other forms of ill treatment, and to be afforded humanitarian visits. Under no circumstances are they to be arbitrarily detained. Third, Guyana calls on Israel to comply with its obligations under international law, including the Geneva Conventions, and adhere to the demands of resolutions 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. We further demand Israel's compliance with all of the ICJ orders directed at it in response to its war in Gaza. Finally, Mr. President, we demand that the highest priority be given to the protection and preservation of civilians. This necessitates, inter alia, improved humanitarian access, proper functioning of deconfliction mechanisms, and the setting up of real safe zones for displaced persons. This war has gone on for far too long, and nothing justifies the horrors that have been perpetrated against innocent men, women, and children in the name of self-defense. Civilians of Gaza are not just casualties of war, but in fact, victims of a senseless ideology in which one party refused to see the other as he is, human beings desiring to live in peace and security. The Council must rescue the two-state solution because that is the only potent solution to the Palestinian question. I pray we all live to see it. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea. Oh, no, apologies. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom. Apologies.
Thank you. Thank you, President. And like others, I join you in thanking Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator Kaag and Executive Director De Silva for your briefings. The UK strongly supports the UN's tireless efforts to scale up aid into Gaza and pays tribute to you and the whole UN community for your work under increasingly difficult circumstances. As you said, your briefing was sober and somber. It couldn't be otherwise, describing an intolerable humanitarian situation in Gaza. As we've heard, over 41,000 people have now been killed, tens of thousands more are injured, 17,000 children are without parents, and 101 civilians remain hostage in Gaza, subject to horrific and inhumane conditions for almost a year. We remain concerned too about the risk of wider regional escalation. We condemn the Houthi attack over the weekend, and we reiterate our demand for an immediate ceasefire and for Hamas to release all hostages. President, we welcome the news that the first round of the UN's polio vaccine campaign in Gaza has now concluded, facilitated by Israel's implementation of agreed tactical pauses. Despite the challenges, including the attack on a UN vaccination convoy last week, this shows that deconfliction can work where there is a political will. So, first, we now need to see this capacity for deconfliction applied to the wider humanitarian operation. Israel has committed to flood Gaza with aid, but this has not materialized. This is unacceptable. Second, President, mass Israeli evacuation notices and the use of heavy weaponry mean that nowhere is safe in Gaza. We join the Secretary-General's call for compliance with international law, especially the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution in attacks. We are horrified by the further killing of aid workers. Just last week, as colleagues have said, we heard reports of 18 people, including 6 UNRWA staff members, as the Secretary-General reported, killed by an Israeli military strike on the Al Jaouni school turned shelter. In total, 300 aid workers have been killed in this conflict, and we repeat our condolences to their families and their loved ones. And we reiterate that humanitarian workers must be allowed to carry out their work safely. Third, the UK will continue to play a leading role in addressing this humanitarian crisis, including through our renewed funding for UNRWA and support for other aid agencies, providing life-saving relief as well as continued advocacy. Colleagues, we're all rightly focused on the immediate priority of securing a ceasefire and a hostage release deal, and we fully support US, Qatari, and Egyptian efforts and call on both Israel and Hamas to take the deal on the table. But we must also consider what comes next. There will be an enormous task in helping those in Gaza to rebuild. Early recovery will include clearing unexploded ordnance and rubble and providing essential services. The rebuilding of Gaza must be accompanied by the rebuilding of hope. Hope for an end to this cycle of violence. Hope for long-term peace and security for Palestinians and Israelis alike. This can be achieved only with a two-state solution which affords Palestinians their inalienable right to self-determination alongside security for Israel. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank Senior Coordinator Sigrid Kaag and Executive Director Moreira da Silva of UNOPS for their detailed and somber briefings. Mr. President, to begin with, my delegation commends the improvements achieved by Senior Coordinator Kaag and her team, including the implementation of the 2720 mechanism on the Cyprus Maritime Corridor through Ashdod Port and the Jordan Land Corridor. We also appreciate Ms. Kaag's office in contributing the massive polio vaccination campaign throughout Gaza. We hope that Senior Coordinator Kaag keeps updating the Security Council on the implementation of her mandate for humanitarian aid and reconstruction in Gaza, which is critical even after the current hostilities cease. While we once again condemn in the strongest terms the horrendous terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7th, it is deeply regrettable that due to the continuing Israeli military operations targeting civilian and humanitarian infrastructure, the repeated evacuation orders, and the total breakdown of law and order, the delivery of humanitarian aid in Gaza has been seriously hampered. It is now clear that without a fundamental change in the political stance of the direct parties, the advancements in logistics cannot garner Resolution 2720's intended results. Under international humanitarian law, it is the legal obligation of the parties to this conflict to protect humanitarian workers and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians. The dangerous incident at a checkpoint in Gaza on September 9th is unacceptable, where a UN convoy to deliver polio vaccines already approved by the IDF was held by gunpoint for more than 7 hours. We call on the parties to this conflict, especially Israel, to implement every measure to prevent similar incidents. Deconfliction and notification mechanisms must be respected. We are also deeply troubled once again by repeated Israeli airstrikes on civilian infrastructure, especially last week's attack on an UNRWA school, reportedly killing 18 people, including women and children, as well as 6 UNRWA staff members. We fully sympathize with the condemnation, frustration, and anger expressed by Secretary General Guterres in his recent statement. Mr. President, the massive polio vaccination campaign shows what is urgently needed to bring about humanitarian improvements in Gaza, an immediate ceasefire, or at least temporary humanitarian pauses. This Council adopted Resolution 2735 3 months ago, calling upon parties to accept and implement the terms of the deal still on the table. It is profoundly disappointing that despite the ongoing pressure on Hamas to accept the deal and on Israel to stick to its conditions, we are not seeing a finalization of the agreement regarding an immediate ceasefire and release of hostages that would lead to a massive influx of humanitarian aid into Gaza. However, even before the finalization of the deal or implementation of the ceasefire, humanitarian aid must be expanded throughout Gaza. It is a miserable reality that since May, when the IDF began its operations in Rafah, the volume of humanitarian assistance into Gaza remains far below even the minimum needs of 2.3 million people, most of whom cannot afford commercial goods. Denial of so-called dual-use items by Israel must be fully explained, and the criteria must be transparent and reliable. As skin infections run rampant, we are deeply concerned that even basic hygiene items like soap are being denied entry into the Gaza Strip. Israel must demonstrate to the rest of the world that they are actually doing their best to facilitate humanitarian aid to Gazan people. Mr. President, I'd like to conclude my statement by reiterating a simple principle. All Security Council resolutions should be implemented without any delay, without any excuse. Both Hamas and Israel need to secure a ceasefire agreement, and this should serve as a starting point for a permanent ceasefire and critical reconstruction efforts, as Resolution 2735 provides for, alongside the active participation of a reformed and strengthened Palestinian Authority with the long-term vision of the two-state solution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，我要感谢卡格高级协调员和 De Silva 执行主任的通报。中方对高级协调员以及人道机构9个多月来为扩大对加沙人道援助所做的努力表示赞赏。我们也支持卡格女士继续向安理会报告。正如通报所说，尽管安理会通过了4份决议，国际法院发布了临时措施命令，联合国等人道机构做出了大量努力，但加沙人道局势一直不断恶化，违反国际法，特别是国际人道法的行为一直都在发生。上周，一辆已获以色列批准的联合国脊髓灰质炎疫苗运输车被强行扣押近8个小时，期间还遭到枪击。同样是上周，6名联合国近东巴勒斯坦难民救济和工程处的员工遭空袭死亡。对人道机构和人员的袭击令人震惊，不可接受，中方予以强烈谴责。工程处依据联大授权向巴勒斯坦难民提供救济，是加沙人道援助的中流砥柱。即便在最危险的时候，工程处一直在加沙坚守。迄今已有240名员工遇难。我们向所有仍在坚守的人道工作者表示最崇高的敬意，向遇难者表示最深切的哀悼。 要求以色列对所有人道工作者遇袭事件进行严肃调查和追责。脊髓灰质炎疫苗接种行动能够开展，充分说明只要当事方拿出政治意愿，扩大在加沙的人道行动完全可以实现。中方再次呼吁以色列从生命和人道出发，履行国际人道法义务，立即解除封锁，开放全部过境点，取消对人道物资准入的限制，停止对联合国等人道机构的攻击打压，为人道机构开展援助提供安全保障和便利。主席，加沙冲突爆发马上就要满1年了。在这1年时间里，尽管国际社会一再发出停火止战、停止杀戮的强烈呼声，但以色列的军事行动从未停止，已经导致41000多名巴勒斯坦平民死亡，令人震惊和难以置信。安理会作为维护国际和平与安全的首要机构，为什么到今天仍不能阻止这一最大的人间惨剧？正如分析指出，如果不是美国一再阻拦，安理会早在冲突爆发之初就可以通过决议要求停火。如果不是美国一再袒护，安理会多份决议就不会遭到明目张胆的拒绝。我们敦促美方拿出负责任的态度，发挥对当事方的重要影响，采取切实行动，推动以色列执行安理会决议要求，立即停止军事行动，为已经饱受苦难的巴勒斯坦人民留下生存的希望。中方支持安理会为早日平息战火、缓解人道灾难、实现地区和平，采取进一步行动。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias. Señor presidente, quiero agradecer a la coordinadora Kaag y al director Moreira da Silva por sus informes, al tiempo que quiero renovar el respaldo de mi país a su gestión. El Ecuador apoya los esfuerzos que la oficina de la coordinadora realiza con todas las partes para avanzar en la apertura y reapertura de cruces adicionales hacia Gaza, para garantizar el aumento urgente de la ayuda, al tiempo que valoramos las gestiones realizadas para conseguir el acceso a Gaza de artículos humanitarios críticos para la salud, gestión de residuos, educación, suministro de agua, saneamiento e higiene. Hasta el 28 de agosto, el trabajo de la oficina de la coordinadora ha facilitado el ingreso de más de 27.000 toneladas de ayuda. El mecanismo 2720 está operativo. Lo que hace falta, sin duda, es la voluntad política que haga posible el ingreso de ayuda en las cantidades necesarias para mitigar la terrible situación de la población civil en Gaza. Colegas, han transcurrido más de 11 meses desde el inicio de la guerra, luego de los ataques terroristas perpetrados por Hamás, que el Ecuador una vez más condena, y son ya más de 8 meses desde la adopción, durante la presidencia del Ecuador, de la resolución 2720, en la que el Consejo exigió a las partes que permitan, faciliten y posibiliten la entrega inmediata, segura y sin trabas de asistencia humanitaria a gran escala a la población civil en Gaza. A pesar de los esfuerzos realizados por la coordinadora, su equipo de trabajo y otros actores aún no se han podido lograr que la ayuda humanitaria sea provista y distribuida sin obstáculos y en la escala necesaria para garantizar el acceso de la población de Gaza a alimentos, agua, saneamiento, electricidad, telecomunicaciones y servicios médicos. La resolución 2720 también exige que las partes adopten las medidas necesarias para garantizar la seguridad del personal humanitario, para protegerlo y respetarlo. Por desgracia, periódicamente se reciben noticias que demuestran que no se cumple con esta exigencia, reiterada además en la resolución 2730. Por esto, una vez más, mi país llama a una completa e inmediata implementación de la resolución 2735, que haga posible un cese al fuego inmediato, la liberación de rehenes, el ingreso de ayuda suficiente a Gaza y la seguridad del personal humanitario. El Ecuador valora los esfuerzos que siguen haciéndose para el efecto. Hasta que llegue ese momento, sin embargo, es necesario continuar con los preparativos para el alto al fuego a fin de garantizar el posicionamiento previo de suministros, la utilización de todas las rutas de ayuda hacia Gaza y la creación de un entorno propicio para la labor humanitaria. Mi país valora y apoya las actividades que la Oficina de la Coordinadora está realizando para este fin. Señor Presidente y colegas, concluyo esta intervención haciendo un llamado a todos los actores que estén en condiciones de hacerlo para que contribuyan con el mecanismo 2720 y agradeciendo a los países que ya lo han hecho. La labor humanitaria continúa a pesar de todas las dificultades y es una luz de esperanza en medio de esta guerra. Nuestro deber colectivo es apoyarla. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Slovenia. First, I want to thank Ms. Kaag and Ms. Moreira da Silva for their work and for their briefings today. Colleagues, today I will focus on political will or lack of it. Both briefers spoke about it, and so did several members of the Council. Ms. Kaag, you concluded your July briefing underlining that there is no substitute for political will and that there is no substitute for the full respect of international humanitarian law. And actually today you, as well as Mr. Moreira da Silva, you repeated that mechanism cannot substitute for the lack of political will. And indeed, today's briefing and humanitarian catastrophe on the ground unfortunately continue to confirm that both have been in very short supply during the whole duration of this sad conflict. It confirms that nothing can replace the absence of political will of Israel to ease or help ease suffering of civilians in Gaza. In December 2023, this Council showed strong political will to alleviate humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. It passed Resolution 2720, which mandated a mechanism and a senior coordinator with a focus on humanitarian aid and reconstruction of Gaza. 9 months later, the mechanism is operational, the coordinator has been committed, yet the main purpose of the resolution, the delivery of humanitarian aid at scale, has not been achieved for lack of political will and disrespect of the international humanitarian law. Corridors have been established and additional crossings open, yet some largely or completely non-operational, including Rafah. Obstacles, uncertainty, and unpredictability keep dictating delivery of aid. In Gaza, challenges continue to mount, from attacks on deconflicted shelters and convoys, evacuation orders, food insecurity, diseases, breakdown of law and order, to destruction of basic infrastructure. We condemn recent incidents, including the attack on UNRWA school turned shelter. We have to end this sense of impunity for lack of respect of international humanitarian law, as if civilians can be subjected to killing, maiming, bombing, torturing, displacement, starvation under the eyes of international community and the Security Council. This is unacceptable. There have been few glimmers of hope. We welcome medical evacuations, which took place last week, and the first round of polio vaccination campaign, which was carried out by WHO, UNICEF, and UNRWA with Israel's support. When there is a political will, civilian population can be protected and can be taken care of. This war has passed the limits of the conceivable of human suffering and of the international order we trust. Yet over 3 months since the adoption of Resolution 2735, we see absence of political will to implement it and to finalize the ceasefire deal. What is growing, I sense, is the political will in the Council to do more to ensure a ceasefire is implemented. We are approaching 7th of October, a year of this tragic conflict. This is not an opportunity, but a duty for the Security Council to show not only political will, but determination to help end it. It is time for Security Council to ensure compliance with its resolutions. The way forward for us is a cascading approach, to exert pressure to ensure ceasefire that holds, a rebuilding of life in Gaza from security, restarting education, health and psychosocial services to garbage collection, an immediate start of the time-bound political process and implementation of the two-state solution, and reconstruction of Gaza, which will unfortunately present a long-term project. The Palestinian government should be at the center of these efforts and plans. Political will of the international community to rebuild Gaza can only happen in parallel with the political will of Israel to engage in a political process leading to its security and mutual recognition. No other solutions of the situation in Palestine would be acceptable for the international community. Thank you. I resume my function as the President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I would like to thank Ms. Kaag and Mr. De Silva for their briefings. Mr. President, as we gather here once more to discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza, I cannot help but reflect on the narrowness of these discussions. We speak, as if by habit, about aid deliveries, about food and medicine, and yet there is hardly a mention of the hostages, our people still held in captive in the most brutal conditions imaginable. The 6 hostages executed in cold blood, whose faces you all saw last time we gathered here, were kept in a tunnel whose entrance was hidden beneath a child's bedroom. We all must ask ourselves how much of the aid ends up fueling the very tunnels that imprison the innocent. How much, if any, of the aid reaches the hostages? How much is stolen by the Hamas terror machine, never reaching the Palestinians? Let me be clear. Israel's humanitarian efforts during the war are unparalleled for a country which underwent its most tragic day and has since been forced to go to war. We have gone above and beyond our obligations, aiming to improve the well-being of a civilian population embedded within the enemy. The statistics are there for all to see. While they differ from the terrorist supply statistics, we urge the Council and the UN to stick to the facts. Over 1 million tons of aid have been delivered via more than 50,000 trucks. There have been nearly 1 million land crossings, providing vital supplies and assistance to the people of Gaza. Hardly a fraction of the crossings have ever been stopped. 800,000 tons of food and aid have crossed into Gaza under Israeli coordination. We have also acted dynamically in response to the changing circumstances. The polio vaccination campaign, ran in collaboration with UNICEF and the WHO, is well underway. As of September 10, over 500,000 Gazan children had been vaccinated. We appreciate our partners at UNICEF and the WHO for their efforts. Despite the slander, the noise, the panic, we have clearly demonstrated our willingness to work with cooperative agencies, those who truly care about the welfare of civilians and wish to work meaningfully with us. The cooperation with UNICEF and the WHO has been productive. Together, we have responded to the needs of Gazans as they arise, adapting to the humanitarian situation in real time. We also value the ongoing cooperation with Senior Humanitarian Coordinator Kaag and her team. But we must draw a line. We cannot work with everyone, and we will not work with those who do not care for civilians, but only care to harm Israel. UNRWA Gaza has become nothing more than a cartel, fostering hatred and prolonging misery in Gaza. UNRWA Gaza does not assist, it enables. It enables the very forces that keep Gaza in a state of despair. We have documented proof of UNRWA staff involved in the Hamas-led atrocities of October 7. Earlier this year, we provided more than 100 names and military IDs of terrorist operatives currently employed by UNRWA in Gaza to Commissioner Lazzarini. This list is part of an ongoing process and does not yet reveal the full extent of the infiltration of UNRWA Gaza. Yet, some here continue to fund this organization as if it were neutral, as if it were part of the solution and not part of the problem. Just last week, as many of you mentioned earlier, on Wednesday, September 11th, our forces conducted a strike on terrorists operating inside a building which was once a school. After we were accused by few dignitaries of killing local UNRWA workers in the strike, the IDF requested that the agency provide details and names of the workers so we may review the claim, as any liberal democracy would do. Until now, no answers have been provided by UNRWA despite repeated requests. However, we have confirmed several terrorists who were eliminated in the strike. These terrorists included Muhammad Adnan Abu Zayad, Yasser Ibrahim Abu Sarar, and Ayad Matar. Each of these terrorists were Hamas military operatives. Each of them was also employed by UNRWA. They have a day job with UNRWA and a night job with Hamas. Colleagues, the most effective way to improve the humanitarian situation is clear: the removal and dismantlement of the Hamas terror organization, the cause of the suffering, the monsters who bear sole responsibility. Defeating Hamas will allow the people of Gaza to shape their own future and rebuild their lives, working alongside the most successful and prosperous nations in the region. Let me be clear, with Hamas left in control, no meaningful discussion can take place about Gaza's future, not about its governance, its reconstruction, or its prospects. The root of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is not a shortage of food or medicine. It is that Hamas continues to hold its people hostage in service of their evil ideology. Our goal is very clear: to defeat Hamas, to secure the return of all our hostages, and to allow Gazans to take control of their own future, free from the grip of terror, free from the incitement and hatred that has poisoned their society for too long. Once Hamas is gone, we want the people of Gaza to administer their own affairs, to rebuild their lives with dignity and in peace, alongside their Israeli neighbors. As long as Hamas rules Gaza with its hateful ideology, the people there will never have a chance at a decent life. As long as Hamas holds our citizens hostage, as our families wonder if their loved ones are dead or alive, the real humanitarian work cannot begin. It is time for this Council to acknowledge the truth. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza isn't due to a lack of food or medicine. It stems from lack of genuine leadership, poor management, and the grip of a terror organization that values death over life. The defeat of Hamas is not just an Israeli interest, it is a humanitarian imperative. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussions on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.